Imagine a world where a single book could change the course of history. John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion did just that. When it first appeared in 1536, it was a small, fiery treatise that packed a punch. Calvin, a young and passionate reformer, poured his heart and soul into this work. He wanted to do two things: explain the core beliefs of the Reformed faith and defend the persecuted Christians in France. The Institutes was like a secret weapon for the reformers. It was compact, only about 500 pages, but it was powerful. Calvin wrote it in Basel, a city that was becoming a hub of the Reformation. He finished the first draft in August 1535, but it wasn't published until March 1536, just in time for the spring book fair. The book was so well received that within a year it was almost out of stock in Basel and Frankfurt. Calvin didn't just stop there. He knew his work needed to evolve. In 1539, he released a revised and expanded version, which grew from 6 to 17 chapters. This new edition was not just a summary. It was a comprehensive guide for theology students. Calvin wanted to help these students understand the Bible better, so he added references to the Institutes in his commentaries on various books of the Bible. The Institutes wasn't just a Latin text. Calvin also wanted it to reach the common people. In 1541, he published the first French version, which was based on the 1539 Latin edition. This French version was a bit different, with some changes in chapter order and new passages. Calvin continued to refine the Institutes over the years, adding more content and improving the structure. By 1550, Calvin had made significant updates, including the addition of patristic citations and a more user-friendly format with numbered paragraphs and indexes. The 1559 edition, however, was the definitive version. It was the culmination of Calvin's life's work, a masterpiece that would shape the Reformed faith for centuries to come. The Institutes was more than just a book. It was a revolution. It challenged the old ways of thinking and offered a new, more accessible path to understanding the Christian faith. Calvin's words continue to resonate today, a testament to the power of his ideas and the impact of his work. Calvin spent a lot of time revising and expanding his book, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. In his preface, dated August 1st, 1559, he explained why he did this. Initially, he didn't expect his book to be so popular, so he wrote it quickly and kept it short. But when readers loved it more than he thought they would, he felt he needed to do better. He wanted to thank those who supported his ideas by giving them a more thorough and detailed version. Calvin worked on the new edition even when he was very sick. In the winter of 1558 to 59, he was so ill with a fever that he thought he might die. Despite his illness, he kept working on the book, making it better. He finished the manuscript in February 1559, and the new edition was printed in August of the same year. The 1559 edition was much bigger and more organized. It was divided into 4 books and 80 chapters. Calvin used parts of his earlier works, like his attacks on Socinus and Biandrata, and his judgment against Menno Simons. He added new content and revised old parts, making the book almost twice as long as the previous edition. When the book first came out, it didn't have an index. The publisher thought the book was well organized enough without one. But readers asked for an index, so Nicolas Colladon, who had made an index for the French version in 1551, created one for this edition too. The French version of the 1559 edition appeared in 1560. Calvin translated it himself, just like he did with earlier versions. The final edition was so different from the earlier ones that it almost seemed like a new book. Scholars noticed that Calvin's writing style changed. He used more concrete and dynamic language, and his tone became more passionate and committed. From 1534 to 1560, Calvin kept revising the Institutes. The book started as a relatively small, 85,000 words, but grew to 450,000 words by the final edition. The Institutes became the most important work in Calvin's writing, reflecting his deepest thoughts and experiences as a theologian. Unlike his other works, the Institutes was meant to be read on its own, without needing any other instruction. His commentaries on the Bible, on the other hand, were closely tied to his sermons and lectures. Calvin often wrote commentaries after giving sermons or lectures, or he used his commentaries to prepare his sermons. Calvin believed that good commentaries were essential for preserving pure doctrine and refuting those who misunderstood the Bible. He wrote commentaries on various books of the New Testament, starting with the Epistle to the Romans. He dedicated this work to Simon Grenius, a respected scholar, to gain support. Calvin's commentaries were detailed and aimed to explain the Bible verse by verse, using historical, geographical, and cultural insights. After his return to Geneva, Calvin continued to write and revise his commentaries. He faced some delays due to the political situation, but he remained committed to his work. By 1549, he had almost completed his commentaries on the Pauline epistles. He then moved on to the Catholic epistles, which he published in 1551. Calvin's commentaries were organized and revised over time, and he worked tirelessly to ensure they were accurate and useful. His dedication to his work shows how important he believed it was to share his understanding of the Bible with others. In 1552, John Calvin published his commentary on the Book of Acts, a work that was based on the sermons he started preaching on August 25, 1549. These sermons were delivered every Sunday morning, and by the end of 1553, Calvin had completed a total of 189 sermons. However, there is no evidence that Calvin gave any detailed lectures on Acts, or that the church gatherings focused on this book, at least according to Colladon's biography of Calvin. Calvin's work on the commentary didn't always match the pace of his sermons. On November 10, 1550, he admitted to his friend Farel that he was making slow progress on Acts, and that it was turning out to be a long task. By then, he had only managed to comment on about 9 chapters. In 1551, he made even less progress, completing only 13 of the 28 chapters in Acts. The second volume of the commentary appeared in January 1554, and it's possible that Calvin finished writing it before he finished his sermons, which ended at the end of December 1553. During this time, Calvin also revised his commentary on the Gospel of John, which was published on January 1, 1553. This work followed the pace of the church gatherings, which studied John's Gospel from 1550 to 1553. Calvin's teaching and writing often overlapped, leading to a series of publications that came out in a somewhat mixed order. In early 1551, he published his commentary on Isaiah, followed by the canonical epistles. The first part of his commentary on Acts came out in 1552, and the commentary on John's Gospel in 1553. Before publishing his commentary on the Synoptic Gospels in 1555, he finished his work on Acts and published his commentary on Genesis in 1554. This pattern of publications was due to the close connection between his written work and his teaching, and Calvin didn't seem to mind the lack of a clear order. Calvin's commentary on the second part of Acts, which appeared in January 1554, followed the course of his Sunday morning sermons. His commentary on the Synoptic Gospels was linked to the church gatherings, which studied the same topic from 1553 to 1555. On June 23, 1554, Calvin mentioned that his main task was to write about the harmony of the three Gospels. He was so enthusiastic about this project that he said, "Once this book is published, I will turn to silent meditation." By December 1554, Calvin was considering stopping his writing and even hesitated about publishing his concordance. He had a difficult encounter with the Genevan Council over his reply to Westphal, which might have discouraged him. However, on January 28, 1555, the Genevan Council received a request for printing permission, and the work was completed by July 17th with the preface dated August 1st, 1555. In 1556, Calvin revised his commentaries on the New Testament epistles because Robert Estienne was planning to republish them. The changes were significant, and Calvin continued to make minor adjustments in the following years. Jean Crespin included these changes in his edition, which started in 1557 but wasn't published until 1563 due to a conflict over authors' rights. In 1550, Calvin began teaching on Genesis in his theology lectures, completing the process in 1552. He told Farel in July 1550 that he had started Genesis and hoped it would be worthwhile. By August, he had commented on the first 3 chapters and sent Farel a sample. However, in November 1550, Calvin's difficulties with Acts led him to put Genesis aside temporarily. There's no mention of the Genesis commentary in his letters until June 1554, when the work was complete and in press. Calvin was then considering who to dedicate the book to, and it was published on July 20th, 1554. When Calvin started working on the Psalms, he faced similar challenges to those he had with the Synoptic Gospels. He took a break from writing commentaries for a few years at least, in the form he had used until then. In October 1557, he told Udenhoven that he had no plans to write more commentaries in the near future because he had just finished the Psalms. The commentary on Isaiah, published in 1551, was unique because Calvin didn't write it himself. Instead, he had Nicolas de Galars write it, based on Calvin's lectures and sermons. Des Galars would take notes during Calvin's teaching and then write the commentary at home. Calvin would review and make changes as needed. The work was dedicated to the King of England, and Calvin also planned to dedicate his commentary on the canonical epistles to the king. This method of having someone else write down his thoughts didn't work well for Calvin, and he never tried it again. When the commentary was reprinted in 1559, Calvin made significant revisions. From 1551 to 1554, Calvin returned to writing his commentaries himself. However, some of his students continued to write down his lectures, thinking that Calvin's insights should not be lost. For example, Denis Raguenier had been writing down Calvin's sermons since 1549. John Boud and Charles de Gennevier, with the help of de Galars, started writing down Calvin's lectures on the Psalms in 1552. Calvin began lecturing on the Psalms in 1552, and Boud-Gennevier and de Galars wrote down the entire text of these lectures. When the lectures ended in 1555, they suggested publishing the notes, but Calvin was against it. He was worried that the material might be published without his permission, so he decided to write his own commentary on the Psalms. He noted in the preface that he was compelled to write the work more out of fear than a real desire to do so. Calvin started his first drafts of the Psalms commentary before June 1555, and the work progressed well at first, but it soon became a long and difficult task. By December 1556, a third of the work had been printed, but the entire volume wasn't ready until July 1557. just in time for the Frankfurt Fair. Before finishing the Psalms commentary, Calvin allowed the publication of his lectures on Hosea, which came out in February 1557. He explained that he agreed to this publication to avoid having to write the work himself, which he found to be a very long and difficult task. In his preface to the lectures on Hosea, Calvin mentioned that his lectures were not polished and were not intended for everyone. He felt that it would be a mistake to consider his spoken words equal to his published works. He also noted that many of his friends believed he was harming the church by keeping his texts from being published, so he agreed to have the lectures on Hosea printed. Jean Bood explained how the lectures were taken down. For years, Calvin's students had been taking notes during his lectures, and they decided to take down the lectures word for word to make them more useful. Bood, along with Charles de Jonviller and Nicolas de Galard, took down the notes and reviewed them together to ensure accuracy. They found that very little was missing, and they were able to correct any issues without much difficulty. Calvin's lectures were known for being slow and clear, making it easier for the students to take accurate notes. Bood explained that it was tough to get Calvin's permission to print his lectures, only managing it after a lot of asking. He said that the style of the lectures was not as polished as Calvin's other writings because Calvin wanted to speak in a way that his listeners could understand easily. Calvin usually didn't have much time to prepare his lectures because he was very busy with many responsibilities. This made his style simpler and more direct. Unlike some other speakers who read from their pre-prepared notes in 1559, Jean Crespin added more details. He said that Calvin lectured without any notes and didn't even mark his place in the Bible. Bood and Jonviller had a system to take notes during the lectures. They each had a sheet of paper ready and wrote as quickly as they could. If one missed a word, the other would catch it. After the lecture, Jonviller would combine their notes and review them carefully. Then he would read the complete text to Calvin the next day to check for any missing words or unclear parts. Calvin would make corrections and clarify things as needed. Calvin was initially hesitant about publishing these lectures because he didn't think they were major works. He even made a joke about it, saying the printers had so much free time that they decided to print his lectures. However, when the lectures on Hosea were published, they were very well received. People like Ambrosius Blarer praised the accuracy of the notes and the way they captured Calvin's words. This positive reaction made Calvin more open to having his lectures published regularly. Calvin's lectures on the minor prophets were a big success. He gave 184 lectures between 1556 and 1558, and Bood and Jonviller wrote them all down. When Calvin fell ill with a fever, he continued the lectures from his bedroom, and these were also included in the published work. For his lectures on Daniel, Calvin started by reading the Hebrew text and then the Latin translation. The printer added the Hebrew text to the Latin version because many scholars wanted to see it. This made the work more useful for those who knew Hebrew, but for the 1563 edition on Jeremiah, the printer decided not to include the Hebrew text to keep the book from becoming too long and expensive. Calvin's lectures on Ezekiel began in 1562, but he had to stop after 65 lectures due to his health. Jonviller described how Calvin continued to work on the lectures even while sick, revising and correcting them. Over time, Calvin became more comfortable with the idea of publishing his lectures, though he still saw a difference between his commentaries and lectures. He didn't consider himself the owner of the published lectures, and the publication process was managed by Bood and Jonviller. In his later years, when Calvin's health forced him to stay home more often, he returned to writing commentaries. He revised his commentary on Isaiah and began working on the other books of the Pentateuch. He also started translating his commentaries into French, correcting errors in the process. His final work was a commentary on Joshua, which he managed to complete before his death. Theodore Beza, in his dedicatory letter for the unfinished lectures on Ezekiel, noted the differences between Calvin's commentaries, lectures, and sermons. He highlighted that the sermons, while valuable, only partially filled the gaps left by the missing commentaries. Beza's assessment provides a comprehensive overview of Calvin's exegetical work, showing how his writing and teaching evolved over time. Calvin was a man of immense work and dedication, even when he had many other responsibilities. He took a break from his writings in 1541 but returned to them in 1545, focusing more and more on his commentaries until 1557. His commentaries on the Book of Romans, published in 1539, were his first major work and contained 107,000 words. After a pause to help set up the church in Geneva, Calvin started writing and publishing commentaries again in 1545. He published about 65,000 words a year until 1550, and then the length of his commentaries grew, reaching almost 200,000 words in 1553 and over 300,000 in 1554 and 1555. The commentary on the Psalms, published in 1557, was massive with 465,000 words. After that, Calvin revised his commentary on Isaiah in 1559, adding about 130,000 more words. He also wrote a large commentary on the Pentateuch, which took many years and was published in 1563 with 412,000 words. Despite the chaos of his busy life, Calvin was deeply immersed in the Bible. He oversaw the revision of the French Bible, preached on 2 or 3 scriptural books at the same time, taught another book to his students, and focused on yet another during meetings with his fellow ministers. From 1538 onwards, Calvin wanted to write complete commentaries on the New Testament, and then the entire Bible. He didn't finish this goal, but he completed a lot of the work, as his colleague Beza noted. Calvin's commentaries were more closely tied to his teaching sessions and lectures than to his sermons. Starting in 1556, his lectures were recorded and published. Calvin wrote commentaries on almost all the books he taught, except when the church sessions covered a book he had already written about. Alongside his detailed commentaries, Calvin wrote simpler works for a broader audience like catechisms, confessions of faith, and liturgical manuals. These were important for the church in Geneva, and were often based on his earlier experiences in Strasbourg. In 1537, while in Geneva, Calvin wrote a catechism called Instruction et Confession de foi. It was a shorter version of his Institutes and explained the 10 Commandments, the Creed, and the Lord's Prayer. He wrote it first in Latin and then translated it into French, though the Latin version was only published in 1538. During his time in Strasbourg from 1538 to 1541, Calvin worked on setting up a French liturgy and published several books. He introduced psalm singing in church services and worked on a collection of psalms and hymns. In 1539, a book containing 13 psalms by Marot and 3 by Calvin himself was published. In 1540 or 1541, Calvin produced a new edition of the Psalter, which included a first version of a printed liturgy. When Calvin returned to Geneva, he needed to create new ecclesiastical ordinances, a catechism, and a liturgy. The old texts from 1536 to 1538 were no longer sufficient. He quickly put together a liturgical book, borrowing from his Strasbourg experience and Farel's work. This book, La Forme des Prières et Chants Ecclésiastiques, was first published in 1542 and reprinted many times. Calvin also wrote a new catechism in 1541, which he described in his farewell speech in 1564. He wrote it quickly because he wanted to ensure that new pastors would accept the catechism and the church discipline. The catechism was written in a question and answer format, making it easier for children to understand. It was published in 1545 and reprinted many times. In addition to these works, Calvin helped establish ecclesiastical discipline in Strasbourg and Geneva. He worked with the Genevan Council to write civil ordinances, and he likely contributed to various ecclesiastical edicts from 1542 to 1560. The ecclesiastical ordinances were revised and completed in 1561 and printed immediately. Calvin also played a role in writing confessions of faith. These were important documents that outlined the beliefs of the church and were used to guide the congregation. Calvin's influence was significant, but he wasn't the only one involved. Other reformers, like Beza and Cordier, also contributed to the church's development in Geneva. Calvin's works, both his detailed commentaries and his simpler ecclesiastical writings, had a profound impact on the daily life of the church and the broader community. They were essential in shaping the Reformed tradition and continue to be studied and appreciated today. Calvin's sermons and lectures in written form are a treasure for historians. Unlike many preachers from his time, we have detailed records of what Calvin actually said. This is thanks to the careful work of stenographers who transcribed his sermons as he delivered them. These records give us a unique insight into Calvin's preaching style and his teachings. Calvin was a prolific preacher. He spoke to his congregation almost every day, often delivering sermons and lectures that were deeply rooted in the Bible. His sermons were not just religious talks. They were practical guides for living a Christian life. Calvin believed that the Word of God should be accessible to everyone, and his sermons were designed to explain complex ideas in a way that ordinary people could understand. The sermons were not just spoken words. They were often turned into books. This was a common practice in the 16th century, but Calvin's sermons were especially popular. People wanted to read and study what he had said, and the written versions of his sermons helped spread his ideas far beyond Geneva. The stenographers who recorded his sermons were skilled at capturing not just the words, but also the tone and emphasis of his voice. This made the written sermons feel as if Calvin was speaking directly to the reader. One of the most interesting aspects of Calvin's sermons is how they evolved over time. In his early years, Calvin focused on basic Christian teachings and the importance of faith. As he became more established, his sermons delved into more complex theological issues, such as predestination and the nature of the church. His later sermons also addressed social and political issues, showing how Christian principles could be applied to everyday life. Calvin's lectures, which were often given to students and pastors, were equally important. These lectures were more academic in nature, but they still aimed to be practical and relevant. Calvin believed that understanding the Bible was crucial for living a faithful life, and his lectures were designed to help his audience do just that. The lectures covered a wide range of topics, from the interpretation of specific Bible passages to the history of the early church. The written versions of Calvin's sermons and lectures were not just for the people of Geneva. They were distributed throughout Europe, reaching places like France, England, and the Netherlands. This helped Calvin's ideas spread and influence the development of Protestantism in many different countries. The accuracy of the stenographic transcriptions means that we can still read Calvin's words today and feel the same impact that his original audience did. Calvin's sermons and lectures were a key part of his work as a reformer. They helped him connect with his congregation and spread his ideas far and wide. The written records of these sermons and lectures are a valuable resource for anyone interested in understanding the life and teachings of John Calvin. The idea of writing down John Calvin's sermons and lectures didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was a natural extension of the close connection between biblical commentaries and preaching. Theodore Beza, Calvin's close friend and biographer, noted that the work of transcribing these oral teachings began in 1549. However, people had been trying to do this for a while, even though they couldn't capture everything word for word. Beza praised the early efforts of Nicolas de Galard, François Bourgoin, and Jean Cazin, who were all ministers. Their work laid the foundation for others to improve and eventually create a more systematic approach. Beza also mentioned the contributions of Beude and Jonviller, who wrote down Calvin's lectures, and Denis Raganier, who took shorthand notes of the sermons. Raganier was paid by the Strangers' Company, a group of foreign Protestants in Geneva, to do this important work. The early history of these transcription efforts is not well documented, but we know a few names. Beza mentioned de Galard, Bourgoin, and Cousin Jais. We have evidence of Cousin's work from the first edition of Calvin's sermons, called Deux Sermons, which were preached in 1545 and published in 1546. We also have strong evidence of de Galard's work from the commentaries on Isaiah. Calvin himself showed interest in having his sermons published, but he wanted to work on them first. In 1546, he wrote to a friend, "You have asked me about my sermons. I would be willing to work at getting them published, but it will not be for this year." A few months later, he mentioned that he was looking for a stenographer, even if the person was only minimally competent, because it was better than having nothing at all. There's a hint that the idea of getting a stenographer might go back to 1542. Calvin wrote that he had little confidence in his hearers, which might mean that some attempts to transcribe his sermons or lectures were already underway. Denis Raganier started writing down Calvin's sermons on September 29, 1549. He and his assistants gradually managed to capture the sermons almost word for word. The first sermons in the summer of 1549 averaged about 4,000 words, while the sermons on Micah in the winter of 1550 to 51 increased to 5,500 words. The sermons on Isaiah from 1556 to 1559 were even longer, with about 7,000 words, which means Calvin spoke at a natural pace of about 120 words per minute. The Bourse Française, a group that helped poor foreigners, hired Raganier and was granted the exclusive right to publish the sermons. Jean Beude played a significant role in this work, especially in recording Calvin's theological lectures. Raganier's inventory of sermons, prepared after February 1560, gives a clear picture of Calvin's preaching from 1549 onwards. Raganier fell ill at the end of 1560 and was last paid by the deacons of the Bourse Française on December 2, 1560. His replacement, Paris Prostat, was first paid on February 7, 1561. A preface by Badius, dated March 1, 1561, confirms that Raganier died in January 1561. Despite his death, the work continued, and sermons from 1562, 1563, and 1564 still exist. Calvin's audience was eager to hear his teachings, which explains why they insisted on having his sermons published. In 1542, Calvin published Exposition sur l'Epistre de Saint Judas, which Rodolphe Peter saw as the first set of sermons that were written down. Calvin revised and rewrote this work himself. The first sermons published without Calvin's revision were the Deux Sermons Jaits en la ville de Genue in 1545, published in 1546. Jean Cousin was the stenographer for these sermons. In 1552, the Quatre Sermons, Fort Utiles pour notre temps, was published, and this was the only work Calvin revised because of its importance. He intended it as a response to calls for a new work on Nicodemism. Starting in 1554, sermons based on Raguenier's notes began to be published. The reliability of the printed copies is a topic of interest. The titles often claimed that the books contained the exact text of Calvin's sermons without any changes. However, when Francis Higman compared the printed version of the sermons sur le cantique que fait the bon roi Ézéchias with Raguenier's manuscript, he found about 450 variations. Most of these changes were minor, like correcting intonation or biblical references, and only about 10 changes affected the content. Overall, the printed sermons were very faithful to Calvin's original message. Calvin was often reluctant to see his sermons published. In the 1546 edition, the printer noted that the author was not accustomed to having his sermons printed. In 1557, Badius stated that Calvin always opposed the idea and never willingly authorized the publication of his sermons. The works that did appear were often published against Calvin's wishes, either through persuasion or necessity. Only the Dixwick sermons of 1560 drew a more positive response from Calvin, as he willingly authorized their printing. Calvin's reluctance had a few reasons. First, he preached without notes, so his sermons weren't as carefully composed as his written works. This made him hesitant to publish them for a broader audience. Farrell, a friend, once complained to Calvin that he wished he would prepare his sermons more carefully. Calvin cared about the quality of his published works and felt that what he said simply and plainly in the pulpit shouldn't be quickly spread everywhere. Another reason was that the sermons were tailored to his specific audience in Geneva and might not be suitable for a wider audience. Calvin felt that the sermons needed to be adjusted for different contexts and audiences. However, the publishers argued that the benefit of the sermons shouldn't be limited to Geneva alone. They believed that the wider church could benefit from Calvin's teachings. One final reason for Calvin's reluctance was that he didn't have much time to prepare his sermons. Calvin often had only a short time to prepare, which sometimes led to mistakes in translation or the development of themes that didn't fit the biblical passages. Despite this, the sermons were still valuable, and many novice pastors used them as a model for their own preaching. For example, in 1561, the pastor Ambroise Faget asked for a copy of Calvin's unpublished sermons on Genesis to help him in his work. Another pastor, Jehan Benoit, noted in a copy of the 1562 Sermons sur l'Épître aux Éphésiens that he began preaching on the Epistle to the Ephesians on August 20, 1564, using Calvin's sermons as a guide. This shows how Calvin's sermons were a valuable resource for new pastors during a challenging time for the Reformed faith. Why did John Calvin decide to write? What made him pick up his pen and start putting his thoughts down on paper? Was it a natural urge, or did external factors push him to do so? To understand this, we need to look at his entire body of work, and especially his polemical writings, where he often attacked his opponents with great intensity. But it's important to remember that Calvin never wrote in isolation. He always had the support of friends and a strong sense of purpose. Calvin's decision to write was influenced by several factors. First, he was responding to the needs of his community. He saw that people were hungry for clear and accessible religious teachings. For example, when he wrote the Institutes of the Christian Religion, he did so because he believed it was necessary to provide a guide for understanding the Christian faith. He explained that he was writing on the advice of a few good and faithful friends who saw the value in his work. Second, Calvin was responding to the challenges of his time. The Reformation was a period of intense religious debate, and Calvin felt a strong responsibility to defend his beliefs. His polemical works, such as his responses to Catholic critics, were written to clarify and defend the Protestant faith. These writings were often passionate and sometimes harsh, but they were driven by a deep sense of mission. Third, Calvin believed that writing was a way to spread the word of God. He saw his work as a form of ministry, a way to reach people who might not have the opportunity to hear his sermons in person. By publishing his writings, he could reach a wider audience and have a lasting impact. Calvin's polemical works are particularly interesting because they show how intensely he engaged with his opponents. For example, his response to the Catholic theologian Jacques Guéry, reply to the principal points of the Romanists, is a detailed and forceful defense of Protestant beliefs. Calvin's style in these works is often sharp and direct, but it was driven by his conviction that the truth needed to be defended. Despite his reputation as a fierce and independent thinker, Calvin's writing was always a communal effort. He had a network of friends and supporters who encouraged him and helped him with his work. For example, Theodore Beza, one of Calvin's closest friends, often assisted him with his writing. Calvin also frequently consulted with other pastors and scholars, seeking their input and advice. At the heart of Calvin's writing was a deep sense of calling. He believed that God had given him a special mission to teach and spread the Word of God. This sense of purpose gave him the drive and the energy to continue writing even when the work was difficult or the opposition was strong. Calvin saw his writing as a form of worship and a way to serve God and his community. In the end, Calvin's decision to write was shaped by a combination of factors: the needs of his community, the challenges of his time, and his deep sense of calling. His writings were not just the product of a solitary mind, but were the result of a community effort supported by friends and driven by a strong sense of purpose. Through his writing, Calvin left a lasting legacy that continues to influence people around the world today.